Welcome to Proselytize or Aposatize with our very special show with our friend Richard the Faithiest Atheist. For those of you who may have be preempting this and were seeing the thumbnail, we are also supposed to have David Paulman in here today, and we were going to be discussing radicalization and religion and how stuff can lead to fundamentalism and such things like that. However, due to technical errors, David Paulman is currently not here. He may be popping in and out of existence at some point during this, so maybe he's the exception to the clam, but all the theological friends will get that joke. But anyway, we're going to continue with this anyway and see what happens. So yeah, again, we're welcoming people here. You know, everyone knows Travis and I, co-host. David Russell's currently out with some family issues right now, but we are happy here to have the Faithiest Atheist. So yeah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hey, my name is Richard Fuddles. I do have a page on Facebook called The Faithiest Atheist. It's not really a ministry. It's not that many followers, but basically I was going to call it the weak atheist, in that I'm not the kind of atheist that goes after theists and says you're crazy or things like that. I'm sort of in between. So I picked the name Faithiest Atheist.
Well, we're certainly glad you could make it. And so this is a pretty interesting topic. And so do you want to just go ahead and start and like lay out what your views are, and maybe we'll kind of just kind of get into the conversation that way?
Sure, absolutely. And just like you guys, I've got kids running around and dogs barking. So if you hear any of that, that's all me. I was gonna, so first of all, just to tell you, I work in the counterterrorism field, and I have for over 25 years now. So my scholarly journey and then my work is all about this, about how people become radicalized. So I'm going to talk about how that probably happens. And when I'm talking about it, this isn't something that is unique to religion. Somebody who's against religion could do the same things that I'm going to talk about, or someone who's never heard of religion can do it. It's what it is that people have this fascination with morality and epistemology. So like what's actually true or false and what's actually right or wrong. Humans are just obsessed with that, or can be. And if they take a journey into what's absolutely right or wrong, or what's absolutely true or false, they can build this framework, this sort of moral epistemic framework. And then in some cases, that framework can make someone start to dehumanize other people. And then if you start to dehumanize other people, that's sort of where the radicalization journey starts. And so I'll talk a little bit about how all that happens. All right. You want me to keep going?
Yeah, I mean, this is we're kind of improvising this right now. So I mean, you won't, unless Travis had any questions or any like key things to get us started into a certain direction.
Well, I'm trying to find out like where, because I don't necessarily disagree with that.
Okay, good.
I think that is an issue, because you know we see it like a lot of religious extremism that can be harmful, very detrimental to society and to the mental health and everything. So that's a type of theism I would definitely want to avoid. And so I don't know how we kind of want to break it down to where we might disagree.
Well, I'll tell you, there's one thing that I usually talk about that people hadn't considered. And then after that, you can decide whether that sounds reasonable or if you should push back. I don't think that we have like an internal struggle between good and evil inside our minds. I don't think that we have this part of you wants to be bad, part of you wants to be good. I actually think there's three systems going on in your mind. And the first system is self-interest. It's like a self-interest. So if you think of morality and epistemology as a wiring system, and if we have three of those, then the first one is self-interest, where you're really thinking about yourself and you want to make sure that you're doing right. But then the second one is a cooperation wiring system, where you want to work with other people. So you see other people and you want to help them, and maybe they'll help you. And some people will say that's still selfish because you're helping in hopes that they return. But we'll say for this case right now that it's just another system. And the cooperation system and the self-interest system can work together, or they can be at odds. If you're really self-interested, you don't want to cooperate, or you could realize that cooperating helps you. But so these two systems can compete, but they could also work together.
So
go ahead.
Would you hold to objective morality? Would you say that it's objective, or do you think it's more of a biochemical processes, or how would you look at that?
My take is that there might be an objective morality, but we all operate as if there is. So people operate and they perceive that there is, and maybe someone's objective morality is completely different than someone else's objective morality, but they're both dead certain, and they probably won't budge on it. And that the unlikeliness that you'll budge on that is something that I think is human. That you could never have heard of religion, you could hate religion, you could love religion, and you might say there's some things that you just we will not budge on this. And that could be because we're discovering it, or it could be the chemicals that just add a little bit more certainty, so that your brain is not willing to look at that. It's just going to say it's absolutely true. So I don't know that it doesn't exist, but I do know that we all carry this certainty that it does. It's just the content of what we all carry disagrees with each other. And that makes me think that it might not be a real thing. But in many ways, it doesn't matter, because if enough people believe it and they act on it, then that's what natural selection is going to pay attention to, is the behavior of all these people, whether they believe in something true or false. It's going to be paying attention to what they do or don't do.
Right.
So those are the first two systems: the self-interest system, and then the cooperative system. The third system that comes up is called the zealotry wiring. And zealotry wiring, we just had it's David, right?
Yeah. Other David. Oh, now he's gone.
We have two Davids popping in and out of existence.
We do. Okay, there he is. Yeah.
So hey, David, I was just saying again about how we have a self-interest system and a cooperation system and a zealotry system. And what I mean by zealotry is that you believe something is so important and so sacred. And again, you don't have to be religious to think something is sacred. You think it's so much more important than you and your own well-being. And you're not only willing to sacrifice something about you in defense of that thing, you also think that everybody else should too. You're like, this is just common that we would all give up something about ourselves for this thing. And that's zealotry. And you could be so fixated on this that it could really affect your self-interest and your cooperation. So if you're really, really zealous about something, it can make you extremely cooperative with people who agree with you, and it can make you really, really hate people who don't agree with you. And then at that point, you might think the right thing to do, you might think the objective moral thing to do is to eliminate these other people. If they don't agree with you about this thing, then you might say, well, we need to get rid of them because they're harming everything. So let's get rid of them, and that'll make everything right. And I think that's why we see sometimes, either a religious person or an atheist person say, let's just get rid of them and everything will be fine. Then we'll start to work on our real problems by just getting rid of them. I think that comes from that zealotry wiring system. And I think that system emerged out of game theory, because if you're in your self-interest and you're just really, really quick and strong, you can outcompete a lot of other people. But if 3 or 4 people have the cooperation wiring and they cooperate, they can outcompete the self-interest person. So then that's how cooperation evolved, was that people working together would outcompete people who are self-interest. However, a self-interest person can ruin a cooperative group. Sometimes the self-interest can win because he'll go in there and just sort of pick at each one that's cooperating with each other. And he takes away their cooperation because he won't cooperate with them, but they'll cooperate with him. And he kind of ruins the whole group. So one self-interested person can ruin a whole village of cooperation people just because he won't cooperate and they will cooperate with him.
Yeah, Richard, I was wondering, because I know for myself, like, I would affirm these natural processes in the evolutionary processes that bring about these neurological systems. But I would kind of look at the underlying metaphysics of it. And I'm thinking, could it be the case that if God does exist, that he would have guided the evolutionary process in such a way that it produces the chemicals like it does to create sort of a moral theater, because it seems like this type of wiring kind of goes into morality and morally significant decisions.
Yeah, all of these three wiring systems are completely about morality and epistemology. And at some point, and you guys might know people, either atheists or religious people, or even sports fanatics or super patriots. They get so far down the moral and epistemic journey that it becomes the same thing. So at that point, they think you have an epistemic duty to agree with this moral, and you have a moral duty to agree with this epistemic conclusion. So you're absolutely right. Everything's morality and epistemology. So that could be that because, a creator made it that way. It's just that from my view, there seems to be so much chaos that it's hard for me to imagine that a creator would set it up that way.
Right. And just one last thing I was thinking about, like kind of in response to that, is it's only where we have this like level of chaos that these decisions are like have like real significance to them. So that's another thing I'm thinking about. But
it absolutely does. There's one of my books. All these books behind me are on this, or on how people arrive at these moral decisions or epistemic, and how that can happen at the individual and group level. But one of my books is about mutual radicalization, where if you have a bunch of groups who are all in that zealotry wiring, and they all think that they're absolutely correct and that the other ones are all incorrect, then you're right. It has absolute real world consequences, because they could be invading each other's tribes and taking each other's resources and killing them, and saying that this is justified. They're not just doing it. They're saying, hey, it's not because I want the stuff. It's because we have a moral duty to eliminate this impurity from the world, which is the way things ought to be. And again, that's not necessarily religious. I know some atheists who say we need to get rid of religion so that we can start thinking reasonably. That's just as zealous as any religious group saying they've got to get rid of another religion. So from that game theory perspective, cooperation and self-interest can both kind of ruin each other depending on the conditions. But the zealotry wiring, when you get to the point where you're fiercely cooperating with each other, but you see all the outsiders as an enemy or lesser than you, and you'll do anything for each other as long as you all agree on something and you're all following the right rules, that's hard to beat. So if there's a village who's just very cooperative and nice, a bad guy can roll in and ruin the whole village because they keep trying to be nice to him, and he keeps being evil and self-interested, and he could just mess up the whole village. But if they're all fierce zealots, he probably won't even make it into the main square, because somebody will probably see him and kill him before he gets there, because he's an outsider. So from a game theory perspective, zealotry wiring, a fierce zealous group can really dominate, which is not to say that, that's what we should all do, but I think that it probably happened enough in our history that we all have that wiring. So at some point, some of our ancestors were like that, and we just inherited that wiring. But we also have this cooperation and self-interest. So it's not like we have to be zealots. It's just that we can go that way if conditions push it that way.
Yeah, I was going to ask, and this I'm going to ask this before I leave, because I'm about to head out. I have to go take care of some things. I just wanted to fix the screen for you guys, because it was cut. When you do the thin screen, it kind of cuts everybody off, cuts a head part of a head off and stuff like that.
Right.
But I would like to listen, and I'm going to go back and listen to your answer. But I would love to learn more about how this happens. How does somebody go from not being a radical, right? Because if I'm thinking evolution, we've gone long enough in this evolutionary process, so to speak, or whatever, and we should be all in that cooperative mode by now. And what I'm hearing is that, like, now there's still this other aspect to us that can make us overzealous and stuff like that. So I would like to understand the process of how somebody that's mutually cooperative, that has this mild dispensation, this about themselves, this
Yes.
mild manneredness, that they're not radicals, but they become radicals.
Yes.
It's for something triggers it. It's like a
Yes.
light bulb pops, and it can happen
Yes.
to anybody.
Yes.
And that's what I want to understand on that process. Maybe you can explain that, and I'll head out, guys. Thanks for taking this over this weekend. Yeah, Travis, just make sure the setting is all the way to the right on the screen viewer. All right, the thing right at the bottom of the stream. Yeah, just make sure that's all the way to the right. That way you can see everybody pretty good. All right, guys. Again, thank you.
Thanks, David.
Take care.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I want to preface my answer by saying that I think a lot of people, their moral and epistemic journey is to say, stay out of it. A lot of people will just say, I'm just not going to go down this road. Don't talk to me about your religion or your atheism. So if you're an atheist and you're trying to stop somebody on the street, chances are 9 times out of 10, they'll say, leave me alone, whether they're religious or not. And then the same thing, if you're, a street preacher, most people will keep walking and say, leave me alone. So I think it's still a moral and epistemic decision. You're still saying it's morally important that I stay out of this. But they don't get into the weeds about why. They just say, I'm going to take care of my own business, leave me alone. And then some people will think, well, I just want to cooperate and I want to understand people and I don't want to hate. And so what David was asking, what would make somebody decide that they are going to become a radical? And I would say that it's taking a step into that zealotry wiring. So maybe throughout their life, they've just been kind of a mix of cooperative and self-interest and staying out of it. But they can get radicalized because there's somebody convinces them, or they come to believe that something is so important that that upholding and defending that thing becomes more important than themselves. And then they take they become hyper-focused on that. And then interestingly, that by itself might not be bad, because if someone's kind of just going to work, but they don't care and they don't really care about relationships and they're just kind of apathetic, but then they find something that's important to them, then suddenly they get up earlier. They take more interest in how they dress. They go to work and they're like, hey, what's up? And they're listening to people because they want to represent this thing. And in fact, a lot of people who ended up doing like a terrorist attack, you go back and you talk to their family and friends and they'll say, it's funny because at first he went from this, kind of miserable person to this wonderful person. And they'll say it's tragic because I was pleased with how he had, gotten a hold of his life and how he was a much better person. And it's because they had found something important. And you go through this transformative experience and even a transcendental experience where you suddenly feel connected to more people. And you start to think, gosh, it's not about me. And you sort of visualize yourself kind of rising above, everything and looking down and seeing all these people and feeling connected to them. And it's very transcendental, it's an amazing experience. And again, it can happen to an atheist. There's people who say, well, once I realized there was no religion, from their perspective, then suddenly I felt connected to everyone as a human or something, that kind of experience, somebody doesn't have to be religious to experience it. They just suddenly feel a connection to more people. It's more important than themselves. And that gives them a sense of meaning and drive that really changes their lives. It really transforms them. And then again, so far, so good. That can be a wonderful thing. And, more people should take that step. But where it goes wrong is they start to become bitter about people who don't take that journey. So like if if the three of us all work together and then I find, and I'll pick something that's not even religious. Let's just say I read a book about Greek history and I find out this one village had changed their election system. And I really, really like how they did their election system. And I'm like, we should run our whole country like that. And I just get really, really, and I just start studying it. And I'm talking to you guys about it. And I'm like, man, you'll love this. And it really changes my life because I'm like, this is how our country could elect their leaders and we wouldn't have all this political vitriol. We should do this. And this actually happened, by the way. I'm picking a real life example from someone who did this. It starts off great, because they found something that's interesting and, and they like it. And their coworkers say, wow, he's cares more. But then nobody's coming on board. No one's like, hey, let's do this. Let's write our congressman. Let's change the laws. Nobody's doing it. And then suddenly I might start to get bitter and angry. And then I might say, nobody cares about history. Nobody cares about our well-being. And then I might say, I need to ramp this up. I need to make a statement to let people know how important this is. And this actually really happened to a guy. He had found this system in Greek history where the elections was based on passing a test. You had to pass a civics test to show that you knew what you were talking about. And then if you did, they just did a lottery. There was no voting. You just, say 30 people wanted to be a mayor or the equivalent of a mayor. They had to pass a civics test to show that they understood how the economy worked and how that area worked. And then they just drew straws. And then whoever was the mayor, and you only got one term, and then you had to go back to your job. That's a great system. And if someone, if that system really inspired somebody, I might, pay attention to them or go to meetings or something. I might like that. But this guy took it too far, and it wasn't working. And he decided he was going to start conducting attacks because he wanted to uphold this idea and cause attention to it. And he was caught before he could actually carry out his attack. And he's in jail now. But it just goes to show, before that, he didn't really care about anything. But suddenly he really, really cared about that. And then a couple of years later, he was miserable that nobody else was in on it. And then he decided he hated other people for not being into it. And he was going to teach the world a lesson and try to jumpstart this thing that he was into. And that's not religious or atheism. It's just he found meaning in that, and that polarization aspect, that dehumanizing others is what consumed him. And that's how that can happen.
Yeah, so I could kind of see something like that happening, like let's say with a religious person, or kind of like, to put it in terms of religious fanaticism, like perhaps somebody locks onto this certain religion, and they start to care for others, to give and like donate to shelters and things like that. But then they start noticing that they're kind of alone, that not a lot of people are getting on board with what they're doing, and right. So they kind of have this bitterness that kind of starts filtering up in them, and it gets to the point where they start acting like in extreme ways to say, like, to kind of like get everyone's attention, say like, hey, no, you need to be on board with what I'm doing.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So I see what you're saying, and I would agree with you that I think that's something that across the board of your beliefs that we need to be cognizant of, right, and watch out for. Yeah, and I really agree with what you were saying also, that it's not just about religion. It can be like a lot of things, like people can almost become obsessive. So that's like a real thing that our human nature via evolutionary processes, however you want to put it, fallen mankind. Right. That's something that I think we do need to like be on guard for. So yeah.
Right. And my take is that I don't think, and for me, when I go on these pages and all these atheist pages and religious pages, for me, it's not Christians versus atheists. It's Christians who kind of have their life together and atheists who kind of have their life together versus Christians and atheists who don't. So it's like, I'll go into a page that say it has 30,000 people. A lot of times you'll have a collection of 12 or 13 people who are a mix of Christians and atheists who all are kind of friends and play the same video games, versus people who come in and say, how dare you talk to them? They're the enemy. And then those 12 or 13 will kind of try to pull them back from the edge.
Yeah. I think tribalism is something that, we all need to steer clear from as well. And like I have a lot of friends that are atheists. In fact, I enjoy talking about like the philosophical pushback on natural theology, and I think it's a fascinating conversation to have. But then again, I look at some of these like YouTube comment sections and things, and it's like really bitter. Yes. There doesn't seem to be like a lot of meaningful conversation. And in fact, not that long ago, we had Ben Watkins on talking about like how theists and atheists can kind of better further the dialogue in constructive ways.
Yes.
But
he's a good friend of mine as well.
Yeah, Ben's a good guy. I think he had a good experience on our show, which is nice because recently he was on a show where it didn't end as well.
Right.
So I don't know if he would still feel. I don't know if it would still feel that way now, but
Yes.
I just felt the need to make that joke in there. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I've known him for as long as I've known David Paulman.
And knowing David Paulman that many years has got to be exhausting.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, this idea where the commenters will come in and just say something kind of hateful, when you're really deep in that zealotry wiring, it feels righteous. It feels, you know, sometimes we'll say self-righteous. If it's not you, you'll say that's self-righteous. But for them, they're like, no, I'm upholding something that's so great that these people don't see it. And sometimes if you're like a really zealous atheist or a really zealous Christian, you might hate other people on your own side more than you hate the other ones, because you're like, at least I understand that they're fighting for what they believe. What I don't understand is why my own people aren't fighting for what we believe. And they see fighting as like, you guys are awful and you guys need to, you know, wake up, you know, repent, or, you know, something like that. And they don't understand why some of their own side is like, well, wait, hold on, let's hear why they got to this situation. You know, let's not just attack. And they think, well, your refusal to attack is weakness. You're weak because you're not willing to fight the real battle. And that's what's going on in their minds.
Yeah, I think one of the more terrifying aspects of what you said is that, you know, people who have this mindset, they actually think they're doing the right thing. You know, that they have this sense of injustice and entitlement. That's pretty scary.
Yeah. There's two books I wanted to bring up. One is called Tribe, TRIBE, because you mentioned tribalism. And I didn't see it right when I turned around. But the thing about tribalism is that it's part of us. It's part of this wiring system that we all have. But it can bring you together with people. It can give you a sense of meaning and belonging. So tribalism can be wonderful. It can even be necessary. But it's the polarization part. So part of tribalism is being polarized, which you don't have to do, but it can feel natural when you're really, really deep into a group. It can feel really natural to start being polarizing towards others. It's that polarization that you really want to watch out for. But then again, if you're somebody like ISIS, if you're like a deep ISIS believer, then you'll think that polarization is the most important part. You'll say that I'm not really in the ISIS tribe unless I'm dedicated to killing non-believers. So in that case, you should think, what kind of group am I a part of? Do I want to be a part of a group where I want to kill outsiders? And then ISIS will say, yeah, because, you know, according to them, God commands it. Of course, you know, hundreds of millions of Muslims will disagree with that, but that's where ISIS is. The polarization is key. And then this book, I've lost the cover. Does your camera reverse the words or not? I don't know if
it looks like it's straight here.
Okay. Thinking Fast and Slow is a really good book. This guy talks about how, besides those three systems that I was talking about, he was talking about how we have two types of thinking, system 1 and system 2. And system 2 is very analytical, where you think about, is that right? Is that correct or not? And then system 1 is like automatic certainty. It's just like an automatic push. So like a system 1 might say, this is a threat, run, don't think, just do it. And he's saying that a lot of our thinking is system 1. And I think if you're really, really in a zealotry mindset, then a lot of your thinking is system 1. And your system 1 is like attack, you know, defend. And so people like that is why they'll just comment, you know, 20 hours a day. You might see the same commenter for 20 hours attacking, and that's all they do all day, because that system 1 is really kind of dominating their mind.
Yeah. You know, I think an interesting question to kind of ponder is like, you know, is there any metaphysical purpose to this? Like, why do you think this is the case? Do we kind of want to get into that, or?
Absolutely, because it's because of all this that I think that there isn't something behind it other than survival. Everybody's chemicals, and then it's just a question of numbers. Are there enough cooperative people that they can kind of shout down their zealots and say, calm down, you know, here's our rules, follow our rules, and you can, you know, have your weird feelings, but you have to treat people respectfully. If you have enough numbers for that, then you can have sort of like a democracy. And if you don't have enough numbers for that, then you can kind of collapse into this tirade where groups just kind of fight each other, and then one group wins or several groups win, and And I think that's kind of how our history is. I think we go back and forth between groups fighting each other, and then there's enough fallout where, enough people who survived it say, okay, stop, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to just try and just understand each other, or we're at least just going to, quietly hate each other, but without, attacking each other. And so we just kind of bounce, I think, back and forth between this vitriol and coexistence and vitriol and coexistence. And then hopefully we have enough people who don't want that kind of violence. So that right now there's a lot more political tirade and vitriol than we've had in a while. But hopefully there's enough people that that's going to, that maybe we're at the peak now and it's going to start to get better again. And maybe not. It might just keep getting worse. But from my point of view, there's not somebody keeping score. It's just us, but you guys would have a different take. You would say maybe there is a plan.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there's so much I agree with you on, but you're kind of saying, well, hey, look, these processes, that are going on, these neurological processes aren't really something I would expect if there's an all-loving creator behind everything. That it's kind of surprising. I mean,
right. That is my take. Yeah. I was raised Christian. I was raised Southern Baptist, and I had a really good upbringing. And the church that raised me still treats me like family. I'm in Arizona now, but if I were to take my family back to Georgia to visit, we could go to Wednesday night supper with them, and it would be a great experience. So it wasn't that my church was mean, but it was exactly what you just said. When I started seeing how people can get so freaked out and weirded out, it wasn't just Christians, it was everybody. And admittedly, that's my job. My whole job is following people who are radicalized. So that could have biased me. That experience could have made me, more bitter than I need to be. So that I focus more on the bad than the good. But because of that, I think it's hard for me to believe that there's somebody keeping score, or even that scorekeeper could say, well, you have free will, so you do whatever. But here's the rules. I hope you do the right thing. But that's you. That doesn't seem to work for me. But that's
right. So I guess what I'll kind of give my take on it, and I'd like to hear from Caleb what he kind of thinks of all this. So I kind of like what Kirk McGregor says, that I think only God is absolute perfection, right? And so and like kind of like Augustine would say, the evil is a privation of the good, and only God is absolute perfection. So anything He creates is going to kind of have that lack. That evil is going to come about, and that. I think a lot of these natural processes are what are necessary for human bodies to exist and to be able to make morally significant decisions in this moral theater that we're in. I think even the level of bad processes are necessary for us to make these morally significant decisions. And there's even an underlying teleology, like, we see animal death and suffering, but it's also what's necessary for functioning ecosystems, where we see, hurricanes that are disastrous, but it's what's necessary to regulate precipitation and everything. So I think these processes are just as at the adequate amount for us to be in this moral theater and make these decisions. And they're such that the decisions that we do make have real consequences. And it's only in this type of environment that our decisions have these real consequences. And so.
Right. Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
You want Caleb to go next?
Yeah, well, I haven't heard from him.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to let you all talk because Richard's the guest, so he has a lot of really good points to make. I pretty much agree with a lot of what he had said. And I think that looking at religion and morality from an evolutionary point of view is really fascinating, like evolutionary psychology. It reminds me a little bit of like Daniel Dennett's work. I don't know how much Richard's read of him, but Breaking the Spell.
I've got one of his books.
Okay. Yeah. But he kind of has, I don't know if it's the exact same methodology, but similar idea of like religion's a natural byproduct of survival, because, having community in this kind of social environment helps us reproduce and survive and so forth. So I think all that's interesting. And I want to plan in the future of writing something on that, because I think that's I actually see that kind of as the inverse of what Richard said. I think that's, to me, more so evidence for God. The fact that we happen to develop this sentiment of believing in the divine, at least most humans do. I think that's our natural default position with psychology. You can look at things like it's called hyperactive agency detection,
Yes.
where our brain associates something with an agent. And so it's interesting to me because people like Dennett will point to that and say, aha, see, all this is just natural. We can explain it.
Right.
But I look at it and say, well, if there was a God who wanted people to be in a relationship with him, would we not expect that we would evolve with this pericope? I can't talk today.
Heritable.
Yeah, there you go. To sense him and to do it. And so I say, like, yes, we have these chemicals that cause us to react in certain ways. But in reality, the issue is all of our beliefs and senses are ultimately chemicals. When I see light, it's because there are actual light waves that are bouncing off and being reflected through my retinas and so forth. But that doesn't mean that just because I can explain it away, that therefore light isn't an objective reality, that the waves are still there. Same with sound and so forth. So I look at it and say, just as I have eyes to see the light that's around me and ears to hear the sound, so also do I have this sense of morality and this sense of the divine to detect what objectively exists. And and then this isn't to say that all of our senses are completely reliable, but I think given evolution, we at least have the ability to recognize that it is. So if in the long run one of our senses is mistaken, we can at least look and say, aha, see, we have a blind spot. We have this, so we at least are able to self-correct it. And I think with the trends of religion, religion's actually growing and atheism shrinking globally, not so much in the West, but the countries that have the higher birth rates are the ones that are more religious. And so I think atheism is going to shrink as a percentage of the world's population as the world goes on. So I look at that and say, well, natural selection really seems to be favoring religious belief here. And that's also because typically on average, religious people have a lot more children than non-religious do, especially if you look at it from like country perspectives. And so I think that we have to ask, is evolution preserving this belief because it's true, or is it only preserving because it's good for reproduction? If the first is true, then, there you go. You have warranted theism. If the second one is true, well, this may hurt your belief in theism, but then you have the evolutionary argument against naturalism, where the question of, well, how do we know, is it a Pandora's box? How do we know which of our senses are in fact reliable if evolution won't correct false beliefs? For all we know, any number of beliefs could be false. So that's kind of how I felt on that. And then just on one other point about morality and evolution, I do think that morality obviously plays a significant role into it. But I think that the issue, and I actually talked a little bit about this in the theology book I did, Searching for Section. This is a new cover, by the way. I redesigned.
Oh, nice.
I remember that. You made a post about how you changed the cover.
I did. This is the first time I actually had it in person, though, so I think I like the cover design. But anyway,
what's the title?
Searching for a Solution to Suffering.
Searching for Solution.
Yeah, it's about the theodicy. But the first chapter on there is on the moral argument for God, and I bring up the notion of can evolution be used? And one thing that I thought was interesting is that ultimately evolution is concerned with gene population and reproduction, and so and what's interesting about that is that is not necessarily identical to human flourishing in the sense. Well, evolutionary flourishing is not identical to human well-being in the sense that we would describe it. So again, with the countries that have the highest birth rates typically have lower standards of living. You wouldn't probably want to live in those conditions, even though they produce more. But from an evolutionary point of view, that's actually better for the species. And if you had very developed countries like Japan that have very low birth rates, that's actually harmful in the long run. Because ultimately, as long as you're able to reproduce, to get to an age where you can reproduce, evolution doesn't really care how healthy your life is once you've surpassed your capacity to reproduce again. And so and you see this with mayflies and bacteria, have very, very short lifespans, but are able to reproduce extraordinarily fast. So I think when we look at things like that, and we look at and say, well, look, if we want the ideal of what's going to make the most people, that's not necessarily correlated to what's the best standard of living. And so, if that's the case, then that means that human well-being really isn't the standard for morality. And so naturalists who try to posit that, people like Sam Harris and so forth, I think that's just mistaken, because again, I think that's just not from an evolutionary point of view, and I think it's inconsistent. So at that point, you're just saying, well, maybe this isn't with evolution, but, and even Ben Watkins, when we talked to him, kind of said this, but we've almost transcended evolution. We've gotten past that. And I think that to me just seems like a taxi cab fallacy of let's get out here. Why not keep going? Why do we have to stop here and say, okay, we're the stopping point. Evolution's gone its course. That seems like your special pleading because it's not convenient for you to say, oh, okay, well, this is the stopping point. Like, no, why not do it? And I think the answer to that is because it's not pleasant and it's not the world we want to live in. And I think deep down, most people know that. And so to me, that's why I don't see evolutionary accounts for morality to be overly persuasive.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's really, that would be a great talking point for us, because I think that's what evolution caught in us and said, okay, this is working, go with this, which is that you have certainty of objective morality. If you have a bunch of different tribes who are absolutely certain that they know what's objectively true and that it's worth upholding at all costs, then evolution will say, man, you tribes of zealots are kicking butt. So go forth. And then, like, if there was some separate entity from reality that could argue with evolution, they would say, okay, well, look at the Nazis. They're absolutely certain that they've got it figured out, but they're doing all these atrocities. Then evolution might say, yeah, but they're surviving and they're thriving. And, look, all these people are, suddenly it's working. And it didn't work for long because the rest of the world got together and stopped it. But evolution didn't care. All the atrocities that happened up until the rest of the world got together and stopped it, evolution was like, I don't care because it's working. And so, but that was, the Nazis weren't thinking we're being evil. The Nazis were thinking we've discovered the right way to live for the whole world. We're going to project this onto the whole world, and we'll do what's necessary to get there. And evolution was like, go forth, do that, because that's working. So in my mind, it's not really a problem of evil. It's more like a problem of evolution sees that morality is working, and it's sort of an amoral decision on its part to not say, okay, but what they're doing is wrong, or what they're doing has so many atrocities involved that I'm not going to pick it. It's saying, hey, if it's working, do it. So it's like evolution makes this amoral decision, and I realize evolution doesn't really select. It's just reality, just what's here and what's not. But just to use that metaphor, evolution is like making an amoral decision to let morality be this guiding force, so that all these groups can do what they think is right. In some cases, it turns out to be great, and sometimes it turns out not to be great. And then it'll work as long as it's here, as long as we're here. At some point, we might all get wiped out by mutant spiders, and it won't matter anymore. But while we're here, that sort of meaning, that sense of meaning and togetherness is working. And so that's why I think that it might be something more like that rather than a perfect deity.
Well, epistemologically speaking, I think it's really interesting kind of what Richard Swinburne says. He says something like, if God is to allow us knowledge by learning from experience and to allow us to choose, to acquire knowledge at all, and to have these justified true beliefs, that we need these kind of processes going on in order for these, our epistemic knowledge to be justified true beliefs. What do you think of that?
That's similar to Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism that Caleb just brought up. It's like Plantinga does that for epistemology, and Swinburne does that for epistemology, and Plantinga does that for evolutionary argument against naturalism. One book I wanted to throw up, I think this is the last book I'll throw out, The Secret of Our Success. There we go. Where this guy was talking about this, people believing, feeling certain that they're right, whether they are right, whether there's an objective truth or not. The fact that they believe it and are acting on it, that's why we're still here. And it sometimes leads to horror and sometimes it doesn't. But he's saying that's why humans were able to take over and dominate and thrive, for those who did thrive. For all the thriving that we see, there's a lot of suffering and a lot of people who died, and a lot of people died miserably. But we kind of have survivor bias. So we kind of retell the story. We say, oh, look at us. We're still here. We're doing really well. And we don't really think about the people who aren't doing well. And then the people who died aren't here to argue. So we kind of get away with our survivor bias. But to go to Swinburne and Plantinga saying, well, the fact that we can trust anything, isn't that miraculous? I agree with that. The fact that we can trust anything at all, it is kind of miraculous. But I kind of wonder if it isn't a survivor bias, in that there was a bunch of trial and error, and then we found something that worked, and we're still here. So we kind of have a lot of confidence in the fact that we're still here. We kind of have this confidence that we've discovered something outside of us. Well, really, it just might be the fact that out of all the people who tried, we're either through luck or through trial and error, we're the ones who are still here. And so my pushback to Swinburne and Plantinga is it could be a lot of people who survived and just kind of have a bias for the fact that they're still here.
Yeah, and I think that this kind of shows the point, though, of saying that, maybe it's this, but maybe it's also just evolution telling us this. But that's the whole point of even saying the statement of, well, evolution, even the study of evolution is still predicated by the senses that evolution gave us. And so we can't step outside and see this through an objective lens without using the faculties given to us by evolution. So when we say things like, oh, evolution may have preserved it for such and such reasons, those thoughts are themselves being given to us by. So it kind of becomes inherently circular, where I think we have to say ultimately that this is a mechanism that is at least somewhat reliable. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And if it's not reliable at all, then we couldn't even be justified in thinking evolution is true, because, how do we know? It just doesn't appear that way. So there has to be some standard where we agree that this seems like objective truth and it's not just and again, that's why I said earlier, is even if we concede all of that, that doesn't therefore follow that these beliefs aren't themselves true, because evolution's given us we've learned so much through science, which again was given to us through our ability to survive in environments through natural selection. And at least to our best of our knowledge, we have good reason to think most of this is true. And so that doesn't follow just because because we can show why we may believe something is moral. That doesn't follow that it isn't or is. If anything, I think if you're going to grant that evolution is reliable, then perhaps we did in fact evolve to get these to have this morality because it's in fact true. And of course, that's more probable under the idea of a God guiding this than the idea of these things being just being necessary truths, and that they also happen to evolve in that such a way. Because again, as I said earlier, I think it's very easy to imagine a world in which morality would be very differently, because I don't think our morality is necessarily consistent with the purely evolutionary reproductive form of what it could be. And so because I think I see those contradictions, I think it's something more than just pure natural selection. It seems to me something more involved in that sense.
I totally understand that. And I wanted to bring up a couple of important things. One is, no matter what we can explain, even if we one day figure out how to create a mind, that still doesn't take away from theism, because the fact that can happen is still amazing. So I think there's been a lot of atheists who say, or even before the atheism, sometimes there's Christians who will say, because you can't explain this, then it has to be that God did it. And then science comes up and figures something out, and then atheists say, okay, the debate's over. But it's not really over. It's just, now it's more of a fine tuning, more than it's so mysterious that it must be God. Now it becomes more of a fine tuning thing. So, and I think that fine tuning can exist for morality and everything else that works. So if you can explain something, that does nothing to eliminate theism.
Yeah, and of course, theism is more concerned with the why questions as well. So I feel like anything you find of, they're just going to, and it kind of gets more into contingency arguments of why is this there at all? We have these natural laws, but then the deeper question is, why did these laws exist? Why does this fine tuning exist? Why is evolution even a process at all? So that you're just pushing the question back.
Yeah. To kind of touch off that, what Caleb said real quick, and to kind of like what you were saying, Richard, the way I kind of look at, I try and look at these things, like you were mentioning, like why these processes are functioning in such a way that they do, and they're, both the good effects and specifically the harmful effects. And I just try to, what I like to do is with these different topics, try and form an inference to the best explanation. And it's kind of like what Caleb said. Well, under theism, under the proposition that if I have good reasons to think that God exists, then I think it would provide the best explanation of why we see this, these features that go into morality.
Right.
That's just kind of my take.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say, because I think about this a lot, exactly what you guys have been saying. One thing I'll say is that part of science is like the ability to have air conditioning and satellites, and those things wouldn't exist if we couldn't trust what our conclusions. So there has to be some degree of our epistemology where we're reaching the objective truth, Otherwise, we wouldn't have air conditioning and satellites, and we do have it. And that's the sort of demonstrable, transferable knowledge and testing that we could pass to anybody else, and they would get there if they have the right resources and follow the right work. They would also have air conditioning and satellites. And so here we are talking in probably air-conditioned rooms through satellites. So we know that epistemologically we can reach absolute truth in these cases, which is amazing. So no matter what an atheist says, I'll always go, still, that's amazing. But then I just think there's another part of our brains that says, it's absolutely certain that God does exist, or it's absolutely certain that he doesn't exist. And if you're so, first of all, I would say it's great to be zealous enough about that on itself. By all means, be zealous about that. The only zealotry I would warn against is the idea that, to start dehumanizing people who have reached the opposite conclusion.
I agree.
So for me, the best situation is for, a Christian and an atheist who say, well, we'll never agree on that, but we agree we should raise our families lovingly in peaceful and productive communities, and, live our whole lives. And then at the end, we'll find out, if that other stuff is true. That's my ministry, even though I'm an atheist. That's my ministry, is to say, you might infer to the best explanation completely different than somebody else's inferences to the best explanation. And from my atheist point of view, I think the way we conduct our inferences probably has a lot to do with our surrounding conditions, and maybe not as much as to what's objectively true. But that's just my atheist biases. So I could be wrong about that. But as you're doing that, just keep in mind that somebody else might reach a different conclusion, and that doesn't necessarily make them a monster. It depends on what they do with it. If it's somebody like ISIS, then I'm going to call the police, or I'm going to call the military or something. But if it's somebody who's living just like me, but they just see it differently, then not only can I be okay with that, I can support them. I've got neighbors on my street of different religions, and we would drop everything in a heartbeat to go help each other. And I think that's the secret. And if atheists can't come up with a reason why that's justified, then okay, then we can say that's our cross to bear. We can say, well, we can't justify it the way you guys can, but we agree that's true. And then you guys can say, aha, you're almost there. And we can kind of coexist like that, even if we have different standards for what makes something true or right or wrong. We kind of agree with the conclusions. Yeah,
I agree completely with what you said, and I think that's what theists and we should strive for that. I think I'm totally agree with that. There's so much I agree with you on, just not quite the conclusion of it all, but there's like a lot I do agree with you on.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think Caleb said something about there's a lot of circular reasoning. I agree with that. I think a lot of it's circular, and sometimes I'll argue with David Paulman on this, that I think you almost can't get around being circular at some point.
I was going to make that joke.
Yeah, at which point
he's watching this, frantically typing his keyboard, mad that he can't join in and correct this.
David would hate the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Yeah,
he hates that
does.
argument.
He's already said, oh my gosh, how dare you mention plan to good in a statement about epistemology.
Or to say that everything's circular, to say that no matter what, you're at some point you have to be circular. David Paulman would be like, read this, read this, read this.
And his internalism is showing.
And I almost think you can't get around it. So I've always said that, how C.S. Lewis sort of became Christian because he realized there had to be some sort of basis for morality. Right. And then Jordan Peterson said that he, realized there had to be some sort of standard for why everyone agreed that the Holocaust was an atrocity. Just like everybody kind of has that Descartes moment, I think, therefore I am. There's something that they kind of base everything on. Mine is if you're standing on train tracks and a train is coming, move. Just get out of the way. And maybe I can't justify why I should move, and maybe I can't prove that I'm really on train tracks. But that's my standard. That's my Descartes, Jordan Peterson baseline is this thing. If it comes, I think it's going to hurt me. I think I won't be here if I don't move, so I'm going to move.
Yeah, and that comes back down to like the most fundamental beliefs that we have, and I think I would put morality in with that. And that's like, because even if you're a evolutionary psychologist and you know all about ethical theory, and you can explain away all of these as saying, well, I believe this because it's good for the tribe and so forth, and you kind of perceive that this is all a man-made illusion that is only good for survival, but there's no objective standard. Let's say that, and you've seen through the illusion, right?
Right.
Even though evolution is what causes you, we'll put that aside. You're seeing through this illusion that evolution has given you. But even then, if you saw someone brutally torturing a child, are you going to sit there and think, well, I'm feeling this anger because this is the chemicals in my brain?
Right.
Or are you going to go do something?
Right.
I think it would be just so. I think some feelings are so strong of a persuasion that they're almost irresistible, and that even knowing
Yes.
that you still can't resist. It's like when you have this contrast of like when you look at like this is going to get a little off subject, but like theories of time. You have A theory and B theory, and a lot of what science points to is, at least general relativity, is certain notions of B theory that change is mostly illusory, and that the presentism is not really true. And yet, even knowing all the data backing it up, it still feels so counterintuitive to how we experience the world that it almost feels like there's nothing. It almost feels like there's nothing that could persuade me out of that, just because it seems my experience of this right now is more real to me than any data you could show me on that. And maybe that's wrong to reject, but I'm not sure. I feel like certain views like that, like free will, even if you were able to show scientifically that everything's determined, I feel like deep down no one lives their life as if that was true.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, and same with morality. So it's like, okay, let's imagine that. Let's take Descartes' notion and question, the existence of everything but ourselves. Let's say that maybe it's at least possible that I'm the only thing that exists, and that this is all just an illusion. The external world isn't real. And let's say that even if that were the case, and I was just a mind by myself with my thoughts, I still would feel like I was free.
Right.
I wouldn't feel like there's anything. I would still feel like change was real. So I would still probably be an atheist, and I would still feel like certain concepts would be more. I would still have emotions, stuff like certain things are morally right and wrong. And so I'm more in. So this is even in a world where the external world doesn't exist. And so if I am more confident of that than I am of the external world, then I don't think anything in the external world could even disconfirm that, because I am more confident in those beliefs than I am that you're in front of me right now. So that's more likely to be false than my beliefs of those. And so if there's cognitive distance and I have to pick between the two, what I'm observing versus what I experience within, I'm going to have to pick what I'm experienced within. Yeah. So it's that weird dichotomy.
Yeah. And if I'm doing something that I feel really strongly about, like moving off the train tracks or stopping somebody from hurting somebody, and if there was somebody next to me going, hold on, you could be fooling yourself, I would just push them out of the way. I'm like,
right. Yeah.
Even if
push them on the train tracks, maybe.
I'm still going to do it. And so you can laugh at me and say, you don't have the standard, or, or you're not being coherent. Okay. I'm so quick to shrug that off and say, okay, but I'm still going to do it. This, my experiences make me think that this could be right. And I could be fooling myself. And that goes to something I was saying earlier, is that I think a lot of our brains, a lot of our activity is us fooling ourselves with our brains. But at the same time, it can't be all fooling ourselves, because we have air conditioning and satellites. There is some occasions where it works. So I just think that there's just those two types of dynamics, that maybe we're fooling ourselves, but we're not hurting anybody, and maybe we're being helpful. And then in some cases, there's just facts, and we can transfer and demonstrate those facts. And it's just kind of good to know those two realms.
Yeah. And, I think I want to say it was Al-Ghazali, the Muslim philosopher back in the day, when he was talking about the laws of logic and like the law of non-contradiction. And there are people today who are even skeptical of laws of logic and say these are just conceptions and that these aren't
David Ballman.
That these aren't objective. I don't mean that they're like transcendent, but they're not objectively true, that things can be true contradictions and so forth. I think Al-Ghazali said that if someone who says that contradictions can't exist should be lit on fire and told that he is both burning and not burning. And but of course that would be absurd. So the fact that you prefer one over the other implies that there is a distinct difference between burning and not burning. So I just thought that was funny. But
yeah, I'm totally okay with things that seem contradictory. And then like if I'm talking to somebody they're so far down their moral and epistemic thing that if you don't agree with them, pretty soon they're going to find something that says this contradicts with this, so now you're obligated to agree with me. In some cases, I'm perfectly okay to say, you know what, you're going to think that, and there's nothing I can do to change your mind, and you might be right, but I'm going to keep doing this. And maybe that's stubborn on my part, but the idea that something might contradict doesn't necessarily scare me out of believing something.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
I
you
was
go
going
ahead.
to say, do you ever watch Tyler? Is it Tyler Vela?
I know who he is. I haven't watched so much of it. I know David Paulman has a spat with him. But
Oh, if David could only be here.
Yeah,
I know he's watching this right now. Just like, oh, there's so many. He has a whole notebook of things he's taking of like things I needed to respond to that were said that were not true.
Right.
Yeah,
Tyler was going to be one of them.
I like to use those two guys, especially if people are familiar with him, because Tyler and David are very similar in that they've come up with a set of rules that are, this is just true and it's not. And if you don't agree with it, there's something wrong with you. And you could put them in a room together probably until their last day, and they probably continue to believe what they believe and just think that the other one is wrong.
Right.
And I just think that their standards for inferences to the best explanation are just stacked differently. And so Tyler will always think that Calvinism is right, and David will always think that Arminianism is right, and nothing they can say to each other is going to change it. But they're both going to see themselves as entirely consistent and coherent.
Right.
And that's where I think you might be able to fool yourself to a degree there.
Yeah, and then they're going to be arguing for the rest of their lives in a room, and you'll just walk in. There'll be two old men there arguing, and then you'll just have the last presidential debate. So there you go.
That's what. Like when it comes to the epistemology, though, when I do an inference to the best explanation, that's why I like to run it through the theoretical virtues. And I know those are like hotly debated on like which take priority. But if a theory can kind of accommodate all the majority of the theoretical virtues, I think that's a good way to guide towards truth.
Yeah, I don't know if you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Richard.
I was going to say I'm all for it when I'm talking to somebody, and I've got friends who are Muslims, and they've got it all worked out, and I'm like, I can definitely see how you have come to that belief and that you see it as completely reasonable, and I don't go after any of that. I know a family that they have a school for kids with special needs. They're extremely Islamic and very strict. They're not so conservative that they're like ISIS, but they just think this is my life and I know it's true. And I have no pushback against that because they're helping other people and they love each other and they love their family and they're productive members of the community. So I just think that they've got something worked out that it works for them and they're not hurting anybody. So and they could be correct. It could be that's all these people who disagree. That doesn't mean that nothing's true. Some of us could be correct. And so I always keep an open mind that, somewhere out there is the truth and some people might have it or some of it, who knows?
Yep. Do we want to wrap up now, or did anyone else have any comments they wanted to say before we close?
I'd just like to say, I think this has been a really great discussion. Really enjoyed having you on here, Richard. And I think this is really important, and I think we can kind of demonstrate how theists and atheists can kind of get together and talk about these subjects and disagree, but not be disagreeable and straw man and attack each other and everything. So I'm definitely all for that.
Right. That's exactly what I was going to say. That you can have, even if you're atheist, you have something that you can't demonstrate. There's some degree of beliefs in what you believe. And I think there are atheists who think, I'm done with that. I've figured all that out. I can see past it. And now I'm just going by facts. And I just think that it's not that simple. I think we all do it. And then in some cases we'll frame it as a religion. Some cases we'll frame it as atheism. And I know some people say atheism isn't a belief, but they'll frame it that way. I just think anybody can do it. So my thing is to, by all means, be zealous about believing it and trying to discover whether it's true and talk to other people. Just don't immediately hate other people, as attractive as that can be. Don't immediately hate other people and assume the worst about them. And one thing I've noticed is that when you think you have it all coherent in a consistent moral and epistemic framework, when you think you have it all figured out, then you automatically assume that other people are lesser morally and intellectually. You automatically say, well, they're flawed in one of these two realms or both. And I just want to say, be careful. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But you could just be so certain that you kind of in this mindset. Just make sure you don't take that too far where you want to, just constantly go after them. I think the secret of our success will be able to kind of agree that we're all going to have different moral and epistemic conclusions. Obviously, we can't let ISIS do whatever they want. We can't let murderers do whatever they want. So there has to be some standards. But I just think there's so much vitriol that there's room for us to think more about working together than to try to eliminate or correct each other.
Yeah, those are great points. All right, well, I think if that's it, I open. So Travis, you want to close us out?
I will. Once again, I want to thank Richard for coming on, and thank you, Caleb. And we're going to go ahead and sign out. Until next time, take care.